Please stay in touch, Frank, and let me know if there's anything I can do to help. I'd really like to help. Then she reached up and kissed his cheek as she turned away. Back at home, Frank was surprised to find his mood lightened. I guess I really needed to talk it out, he said to himself. The following Saturday, Frank was in the yard picking up limbs that had fallen during a thunderstorm. When he entered the house, he saw Laurie talking on the phone. He turned to Bobby, who was standing nearby. Did someone call? Asked Frank. No, Bobby replied dismissively, she's just talking to her new best friend, Celia. Frank was surprised. Does she call Celia a lot? And what's a BFF? Oh, Dad, Bobby replied in despair, you're totally off the mark. BFF is best friend forever. At that moment, Laurie looked up and saw her father. Daddy, can we take Celia to dinner? Let me talk to her, he said, holding out his hand to his daughter. When she handed him the phone, he said, Hi, Celia. I think you heard that. Would you like to have dinner with Laurie tonight? Bobby, and I will be here too. He heard her melodious laugh followed by a quick agreement. Very well, he said. Why don't you come here about 6 o'clock? After they agreed, Frank hung up the phone and turned to his daughter. Well, here she comes, he said. I hope you'll be happy. Oh, yes, Daddy. She squealed. Well, in that case, you and Bobby need to clean up the place so she doesn't think we're living like pigs. Oh, Daddy, do I have to? Complained Bobby. But before Frank could answer, the boy turned and began to gather up the clothes he had left in the room. He's still a teenager, Frank thought, but he seems to be getting better. Turning to head for the kitchen, Frank began to ponder what dish he should make. Definitely something better than spaghetti and meatballs, he thought, remembering the first time Celia had dined with them. He finally settled on a fish dish, which he considered one of his specialties. He was sure he could make it, and the kids liked it, which was always a plus. For that, he knew he would have to make a trip to the grocery store. After explaining his errand to Bobby and Laurie, he told them to stay in the house until he returned. He found a nice piece of salmon in the seafood department, and then decided to pick up some dessert at the bakery. I should grab a nice bottle of wine, he thought, and directed his cart to the appropriate aisle. Once he found what he wanted, he looked in the floral section of the store and bought a bouquet for the table. On the way home, he thought about what he was doing. I'm really gorging myself on this food, he realized with surprise. Eventually, he decided it was because he owed Celia a good lunch. After all, I've ruined her lunch, he said to himself. Celia rang the doorbell at 6 o'clock, and before Frank could get to the door, Laurie was already ushering her in. To Frank's amazement, even Bobby decided to show up, and the teenager made polite conversation. Frank, for his part, felt a little awkward and inarticulate, but if Celia noticed, she didn't show it. Instead, she chatted cheerfully with Laurie and willingly went with her to see what the girl wanted to show Celia in her room. By the time they reappeared, dinner was almost ready. The dinner was a great success. Celia was duly impressed by his culinary abilities. Oh, a man who can cook. Mother warned me about the likes of you, she teased. And the fact that he was clearly at ease with the children, both of whom chattered away in response to her questions. When dessert was finished, she insisted on joining in the cleanup, and with her help, the dishes were soon put away, rinsed, and put in the dishwasher to run later. At this point, Bobby excused himself to continue a video game he had paused, and Laurie wanted to watch a favorite program she had videotaped. So the two adults filled their glasses with wine and went out into the living room. It was wonderful, Frank, Celia complimented him. I don't know when I've had such a good time. Thank you so much for inviting me. I don't think Laurie would ever talk to me again if I didn't, Frank laughed, and Celia joined him. "She's a wonderful girl, and you're lucky to have her," she replied. "And her father's doing a pretty good job too." Frank felt his face redden, but then Celia's face took on a more serious expression. "Frank, besides having a great time with you, I'm glad you invited me because I have some information I want to share with you." Frank caught the new intonation in her voice and looked at her curiously. "This is very confidential, Frank, but I think I know you well enough to trust you, and it concerns you, at least indirectly." Now she had definitely gotten his attention, Frank thought. "As you know," Celia began, "the GBI was supposed to conduct a routine investigation before issuing your wife's death certificate, and as you also know, we found nothing that would give us a reason to refuse to issue a certificate that was properly issued." She took a deep breath and continued, "Naturally, we did the same thing with John Collier, but we discovered a few oddities. First, it turned out that he was in financial trouble after a series of bad investment decisions." Frank nodded. What Celia had said matched what Amanda Collier had told him. "Furthermore," Celia continued, "IMC Security has informed us that they have discovered what appears to be significant irregularities in the Southeastern Accounting Department, headed by John Collier. Even more disturbing, they believe they have uncovered a fraudulent billing scheme that may have resulted in the embezzlement of millions of dollars from IMC, and John Collier appears to have authorized it." "Poor Amanda," Frank commented, "she didn't deserve that." But then he began to consider what Celia had told him, and new possibilities opened before him. Could John Collier have had a hand in the disaster? He asked. Could it have been a way of covering his tracks? When Celia said nothing, Frank's imagination kicked into overdrive. What if Meredith found out about Collier's scheme? What if he killed her to silence her and caused the plane crash to hide the evidence? Maybe he's still alive, maybe he's hiding out in some villa by the sea and laughing at all of us. "Take your time, Frank," Celia urged. "You're getting carried away. The most likely scenario remains that the plane went down unexpectedly, as we assumed all along. If Collier was really involved in the embezzlement scheme, the crash interrupted his plans. We'll explore all the possibilities, but we can't jump to conclusions, and neither should you." But Frank had a hard time shutting off his imagination. "You don't think Meredith could have been involved, do you?" he asked sharply. Celia sighed. "It's not out of the question," she agreed, "but we don't think it's likely. For one thing, if she was involved, it would mean she planned ahead of time to abandon her family. It's unusual for a mother to abandon her children, especially children their age," she said, gesturing to the children's rooms. Collier, on the other hand, had no children, and his wife reported that their marriage was on the verge of falling apart at the time of his disappearance. Moreover, unlike Kohler, Meredith's finances were in perfect order, and prior to her disappearance, she had done nothing to suggest that she was involved in any plan, if indeed there was one. In fact, her actions were exactly the opposite of those of a person planning to disappear. But it's all just speculation. The only fact we have, Celia continued, is that Meredith's plane did indeed crash into the sea. She had hoped to reassure Frank, but when she looked at the man, she realized he was still upset by her revelations. "Frank, you have to promise me that you won't say anything about any of this. It's very confidential, and if it gets out, it could jeopardize our investigation. It could also lead to my dismissal." This made Frank tense. He realized that Celia had taken a risk in confiding in him, and he was obliged to remain silent. "I understand, Celia, and I promise I won't compromise your investigation. But I have to ask, why did you tell me all this?" He looked at her seriously. "It's unlikely, Frank, but there's always the possibility that you'll hear something or learn something that will help us shed some light on all this. If you do, Frank, promise me you'll get back to me right away. No Lone Rangers, please." He returned her gaze. "I promise, Celia." Then he smiled. "Besides, if I have to mess with you again, it won't be such a drag." The smile she gave him seemed to light up the entire room. Shortly afterward, Celia had to leave. Before doing so, she said goodbye to Bobby and Laurie. Frank noted that Bobby had interrupted his game to say goodnight to her, which was a real compliment from him. Laurie walked her to the door, again snatching Celia's promise to call her. But this time, after Laurie hugged her, Celia didn't fail to lean against the door and kiss Frank on the cheek as she walked to her car. Laurie looked at her dad and said, "She likes you, Dad." Frank smiled at his daughter and pulled her close to him. "Well, I like her too." When everyone had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Frank lay in his bed, thinking over what Celia had told him and all the different scenarios he had imagined. "Oh Mary," he thought, "what have you gotten yourself into?" Finally, he fell into a restless sleep. A week later, Frank was sitting at his computer and noticed something unusual. He was reading about some of his favorite sports teams, and as he was about to click on the Falcons tab, he noticed a Facebook icon right above it. On a whim, he clicked on it. Frank wasn't a Facebook follower, in fact, he rarely logged onto the site at all. The only reason he had an account was so he could keep track of his children. Bobby and Laurie loved the social networking site and used it as another way to stay in touch with their friends. Frank didn't mind at first, but after reading a couple of scary articles about some of the pitfalls, he started his own account and insisted that Bobby and Laurie add him as a friend. He also asked them to give him the passwords to their pages. That way, he reasoned, I'd be able to see all the messages and pictures they posted, as well as anything their friends sent them. More importantly, he thought, Bobby and Laurie would know that he could spy on them, and he hoped, that would encourage them to be discreet. When he logged onto his page, most of what he saw didn't interest him, but he did notice a friend request from someone he'd never heard of, Tom Thomason. The name seemed unfamiliar to him, and there was no photo, just a silhouette. When Frank clicked on the name, the stranger's page blandly informed him that personal information was only available to friends. "Hey, Bobby," he called out. "Do we know any Tom Thomason?" His son walked into the room and saw his father browsing Facebook. "Oh, that guy. Just ignore him, Dad. He's been trying to get me to add him as a friend for weeks now. I just delete his requests." At that moment, Laurie peeked into the room. "Yeah, he tried to friend me too. He's just some creep on Facebook." It was enough to get Frank's attention. Some unknown person wanted to make contact not only with him, but also with his children. Frank knew that there were all kinds of scammers out there, as well as some much scarier predators. He was alarmed but didn't want to scare the children, so he only said, "You two did exactly the right thing," he assured them. "Never respond online to anyone you don't know well." As he searched for a way to protect his family, an unexpected idea occurred to him. "Maybe Celia can help us find out who this creep Thomason is." He called her home, and she must have seen his name on the caller ID because she answered warmly. "Hi, Frank." "Hi, Celia. I'm glad I caught you. Is there any chance you could come over? Something strange has come up, and I'd like to find out with you if you're free. It's nothing serious, is it?" "Bobby and Laurie are fine, aren't they?" As he comforted her, Frank couldn't help but notice that she seemed as concerned about his children as he was himself. It gave him a warm feeling. She told him she was working in the yard but would be able to drive up in 45 minutes. To Frank's surprise, almost exactly the minute her car pulled up to the curb with Mary, he remembered he was lucky if she was no more than an hour late, trying to make her image perfect. But Celia arrived right on time, clearly freshly washed, dressed in a casual but attractive outfit, with neatly styled hair and fresh makeup. It was obvious that she had made an effort, even in such a short time. "You look good, Celia. You didn't need to dress up for us," he told her. She squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Frank. I wanted it so much." Once she was in the house, Frank called his children over. As they noisily entered the room, he asked them to tell Celia about their potential Facebook friend. Bobby, as the official expert in the family, took the opportunity to brag. Quickly logging into each of the family's 3 Facebook accounts in turn and receiving friend requests from the mysterious Tom Thomason, praising Bobby's skill. Celia sat down in front of the screen and called up all the unread and archived messages, but couldn't find any additional information. Finally, she looked up at Bobby and Lori. The most likely answer is some sort of marketing ploy. If you accepted the request, you'd probably get all sorts of ads for junk you don't need or offers to buy imaginary gold from Nigeria. There are bad people in the world, and you should never let strangers know about you, okay? Both children nodded solemnly, and Frank thought to himself that the message they had heard from Celia probably had a stronger effect on them than when he had delivered it. While they were working on the computer, it was getting dark outside, and Frank knew his kids would be hungry soon. "Celia, we'll probably go out to dinner soon. It won't be anything fancy, just a family restaurant, but we'd love for you to join us if you can." As Frank had anticipated, Lori and even Bobby immediately began demanding that she come with them. She laughingly surrendered to the inevitable, and the 4 of them piled into Frank's sedan and drove to a casual spot near their home. As they drove, Celia began asking the children about what she'd seen on their Facebook pages, and soon Lori and Bobby were eagerly talking about their friends and activities. Listening to the conversation, Frank wondered if Celia probably already knows more about what's going on in Lori and Bobby's lives than Mary ever did. He remembered that on the rare occasions they had gone out together before her death, Meredith's conversations had mostly revolved around her work. He felt guilty for his infidelity, but knew it was true. The lively conversation continued during dinner and the drive home, and Frank was delighted when Celia entered the house with them. The children immediately sat down in front of the television and asked Celia to watch with them, but she waved them off. "I need to talk to your daddy for a while," she said, taking his hand and leading him into the living room. After they sat down, her face became serious. "I didn't want to alarm Bobby and Lori, but I don't think those Facebook requests were a marketing ploy. The Bureau has received alerts about some identity theft scams, but they usually don't target children. To me, it looks like someone is purposely trying to get your family's information." The thought of his children being in danger sent a chill through Frank. Who could it be? What could they possibly want? "I don't know, Frank," she replied. "This is unlike any cyber fraud model I've seen before. What can we do? Close their Facebook accounts? Maybe keep them off the net altogether?" She looked thoughtful. "I don't think it's necessary, provided they're careful not to communicate with strangers. And if they get nonsensical emails with embedded websites, warn them never to click on the links." She thought for a moment longer, then spoke. "The problem with the internet is that it's so amorphous. You can't tell who you're dealing with or where they are. But it's not as opaque as a lot of people think. I have a friend in the federal government who might be able to help us. He probably won't be able to find out who Tom Thomason is, but he might be able to tell us where he lives. Let me call on Monday and let you know what I find out." With those words, she got up and went to her room to say goodnight to the 2 children. When she returned, Frank walked her to the door. But before she opened it, he hugged her. "You've been like a guardian angel to us," he said sincerely. "I don't know what we would have done without you." She looked into his eyes for a moment and then kissed him quickly on the lips. "I don't know if I want to be an angel," she said with a wink. "They don't have much fun." She then turned and walked quickly to her car, leaving Frank standing there bewildered. True to her word, Celia called Frank late Monday morning. "Do you know anyone in Palm Beach, Florida?" she asked. "Not a soul," Frank replied. "Whoever Tom Thomason is, he created his Facebook account with a zip code starting with 334, so he's somewhere in Palm Beach County," she said. "I can't imagine why someone in Palm Beach would try to contact us," Frank said. "But at least he's not around. That's reassuring." "I agree," Celia said. "Besides, we've been tracking a lot of scams in South Florida, so maybe this really is some new kind of internet scam. Just make sure Bobby and Lori have nothing to do with these friend requests." "I will, Celia, and thank you. I feel so much better about the whole thing. I'm so glad I could help." Frank, in spite of what he had said to Celia, was not in the least reassured. On the contrary, it seemed to him that he and his children were under continuous attack. First came the terrible news of Meredith's death, then poor Bobby confessed that his wife had cheated on him. Then he got word that Mary might have been involved in some fraudulent business dealings before her death, and now some unknown person was trying to get information about his children. Frank felt like they were under siege, and he decided he would fight back. His first priority was to find the enemy in Palm Beach County and confront him. But how could he do that? A cursory internet search showed that the county had a population of 1.3 million. Looking for Tom Thomason would be like looking for a short stick in tall grass. Besides, Frank thought, it was just as likely that the name could be fake. Frank's ordered mind continued to beat over the problem. Then an idea struck him. "If I can't find Thomason, maybe I can get him to find me," a plan began to form in his mind. "The chances are slim," he admitted, "but it's all I've got." The first thing he needed to do was to get Bobby and Lori out of the way. It was almost time for summer vacation, and that gave Frank an idea. He dialed his in-laws' number. "Dad, would you and Mom like Bobby and Lori to come visit us for a week? I'll need to go out of town during that time, so you'd be a big help." The children's grandfather happily agreed, and all the issues surrounding their stay were resolved. Frank hung up the phone and immediately called Delta. "I'd like to book a flight to Palm Beach," he said. His children welcomed the news of their upcoming visit to their grandparents, but their enthusiasm waned when they learned that their father would not be traveling with them. It would be the first time they would be separated since their mother's death, and the prospect brought back the fear of abandonment they had felt since then. Frank hated to cause the children any distress, but he felt that he must do what he intended, and he succeeded in persuading them. A week before their visit, doubts began to plague Frank. "Am I doing the right thing?" he asked himself. But despite the uncertainty, the thought of doing nothing was worse. His inner turmoil was briefly interrupted by a phone call from Celia, who called to inquire how he and his family were doing. After a few minutes of conversation, the tone of her voice changed slightly, and Frank thought she sounded almost shy. "I was wondering if you wanted to get together next week. I haven't seen you and the kids in a while," she said, her voice trailing off uncertainly. "I'd love to do that, Celia, but then I'm taking the kids to their grandparents for the week," he replied. "Oh," she said. "I understand. Maybe some other time." "I'd like that very much, Celia," he said fervently. Frank felt bad about lying to Celia about his plans, but he told himself at least it was partly true. Besides, he was sure he knew what she would say if he revealed his true plans. When Frank returned home and took the children to his relatives in the village, he immediately sat down at the family computer. One of the reasons he asked Meredith's family to take his children was that he knew they didn't have a computer, so he felt safe logging on to Lori's Facebook. Sure enough, a friend request came in from Tom Thomason. Frank clicked on the accept option and quickly received confirmation that Laurie was now friends with this stranger. If nothing comes of this, Frank thought, I'll just unsubscribe from him later. Next came the hardest part, pretending to be a 12-year-old girl. He studied his daughter's previous messages and decided that he could imitate her style quite well. I may not be able to fool her friends, he admitted to himself, but I hope I can fool Tom Thomason. He decided that his first communication should lay the foundation and wrote a short note of his visit to the country. Laurie, just a little news for her friends, thought Frank, nothing to arouse the suspicions of the workers. The next day, he planned to set a trap. OMG, I'm going to Florida. My best friend Celia offered to take me with her, and my dad agreed. Flying out tomorrow, can't wait, Frank typed. He decided to call Celia by her first name because it seemed to him that neither Laurie's friends nor Tom Thomason knew her. He hoped Celia wouldn't mind. Now that the lure was in the water, Frank hoped he could jiggle it enough to get the fish's attention. I can't believe I'm in Palm Beach, it's to die for. He posted in the evening. The next morning, Frank posted a note that he hoped would catch on. I'm going back to the beach tonight. Tomorrow, Celia is taking me shopping on Worth Avenue. We'll have lunch at Tarbo's Tequila, he wrote. As soon as the entry appeared on Laurie's page, Frank headed to Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. Soon, he was already settled in his seat for the 2-hour flight to Palm Beach. Looking out the window, he remembered that he had been to Palm Beach once before. In fact, he and Mary had driven through town on their way back from their honeymoon in Miami Beach. They'd driven over the Lake Worth Bridge and then traveled down Southern Ocean Boulevard, admiring the mansions overlooking the Atlantic. After landing, Frank rented a car and drove to the motel in West Palm Beach where he had booked a room. There was a fast food restaurant across the street, and he grabbed a sandwich and a Coke, which he ate in the room while studying a map of the city on his laptop. He hoped he was doing the right thing. After breakfast, he checked Laurie's Facebook page but found only a few envious replies from her classmates. He didn't expect Thomason to contact him, but he hoped his fishing expedition might find something around 10 a.m. He got in his car and drove east over the Royal Park Bridge, turned south, and then east again to Worth Avenue. He wanted to be there early and he needed to park the car on the street so he could get there quickly if necessary. After driving around the block where the restaurant was several times, he was beginning to wonder if he had miscalculated. But suddenly, a car pulled out in front of him, and he was able to pull into the parking space. Setting the meter down, he walked down the street in front of the restaurant, noticing a bench in the shade. He gratefully took a seat on it, grabbed his baseball cap and sunglasses and put them on, hoping to disguise himself. Then, he pulled out a copy of the Palm Beach Post and pretended to read while looking around the street. As he sat there, the realization of how flimsy his plan was slowly began to set in. He had no idea the mysterious Tom Thomason had seen the fake posts on Laurie's Facebook page and would show up in response. Worse, Frank had no idea who he was looking for unless the mystery man turned out to be John Collier, which Frank thought was unlikely. How would he be able to recognize the threat? All he could hope for was to spot the suspicious man, whatever that meant, and come face to face with him. The street was crowded, and Frank kept trying to keep track of all the passers-by. The restaurant was starting to fill up, and his stomach rumbled as he watched the people coming in. He cursed himself for not thinking to bring a sandwich, but he didn't dare leave his post. Time stretched slowly as he sat there, and after a while, he saw the crowd in the restaurant begin to thin. Glancing at his watch, he realized it was over an hour later. What an idiot, he thought. I wouldn't be any worse off if I stayed home, and at least I could see Celia again. While he was looking at the shoppers passing by, a woman strolling across the street caught his eye. Here I go again, Frank thought, seeing Mary in a crowd of strangers. In fact, he noted the woman looked nothing like Meredith at all. Meredith had shoulder-length brunette hair, and this woman was a blonde with a short haircut, and her clothes were different from anything Frank had ever seen Meredith wear. But there was something eerily familiar about her, and as he continued to watch her, Frank realized that it was her gait that had triggered his reaction. He impulsively got up and followed her. Glancing down the street, he saw that the blonde had reached the corner and was trying to hail a cab. Risking his life, Frank ran across Worth Avenue and jumped into the car just as he pulled away from the curb. He saw the woman climb into the back seat of the cab and raced down the avenue toward the Atlantic. Before reaching Southern Ocean Boulevard, the cab turned left onto County Road and headed north. Frank followed it for some distance. Finally, he saw that the cab turned left onto a suburban street and kept going until it got almost to Lake Worth. Frank stopped the car at the curb about a soccer field away and watched as the woman paid the driver and then entered an elegant house that faced the lake. Frank squinted his eyes, trying to get a good look at her. With her hair color and short cut, she looked nothing like Mary, but she was the same height and weight. As she walked down the path toward the house, Frank was again amazed at her gait. Sitting in the car, Frank suddenly remembered a book he had read a long time ago. In the story, an actor needed a disguise, but instead of a false mustache or wig, he just put pebbles in his shoes. "If someone sees me," the actor told his friend, "they'll say, 'Looks like that guy,' but it's not him because I'll walk differently." It works the other way too, thought Frank as he recalled the book. The certainty grew in him, that he had just seen his deceased wife. Trying to hold back his growing anger, he ran down the street and walked to the door. He rang the doorbell and crossed his arms, waiting. Opening the door, the woman looked at him with a perplexed look. Then she did a double take and shrieked, "Frank, what are you doing here?" "Hello, Mary," he said sarcastically. After a moment's hesitation, she spread her arms to hug him, but he quickly raised his hands to stop her. "Don't touch me," he growled. Then, unable to contain his anger any longer, he shouted, "How could you do this to me? How could you leave Bobby and Laurie?" Throwing an anxious glance outside, Meredith grabbed his arm and dragged him into the house, slamming the door behind her. "I did it all for you, baby. For you and the kids," she urged. "You have to believe me. It was the only way out." As she spoke, she looked around nervously. "What the hell are you talking about?" demanded Frank hotly. "You're missing the point. None of this makes any sense." "Sit down, little one," she cooed, urging him on. "You have to let me explain everything." She was still speaking loudly and rubbing her hands together nervously, sitting down and urging him on when Frank finally sat down. "Okay, Mary, I'm listening," he said. "I was so close to it, baby. I had a coveted big job in my pocket, but then the damn economy went down. I knew if I could get a little more bang for the buck in the region, the economy would recover and the promotion would be secure," she explained, smiling pleadingly and holding out her palms to her husband and Frank. "Once I got this job, we'd be on easy street. No worries about paying for college for the kids, no worries about retirement, no worries ever again." Frank could barely contain himself. "Was it all about money and your position in the company?" Meredith's hands rested on her lap again. "So Jan and I, John Collier," said Frank grimly. "Yes," she continued, not catching his mood. "You've met him anyway. He and I figured out a way to move a few sales from our biggest accounts. We knew they'd show up eventually, we just booked them earlier in the current quarter. Every other region was reporting a significant decrease in sales, and we had a significant increase. The corporation was just thrilled. We earned the biggest bonuses the company has ever paid," she said proudly. Then, the smile slid off her face like a cloth falling to the floor. But the economy was getting worse, not better. And when John told me it would all come out eventually, I knew we had to do something about it. We knew we'd need a lot of money to pull this thing off, so John created a dummy vendor account and started sending fake invoices to IMC. They're so sloppy and wasteful over there, they didn't even notice. So, you were planning to fake your death in a plane crash to cover your tracks? Asked Frank bitterly. That's right, kid, she said, as if Frank was her star pupil. With enough money, it's not hard to get someone to leave a Zodiac motorboat with a GPS signal in the Caribbean. We just headed in on the signal and landed right next to it. So, this whole thing was just a way to steal a lot of money and abandon the family? Asked Frank bitterly. No, baby, that's not it at all. I knew I'd have to get out of sight for a while, but I made sure you and the kids were okay. I took out life insurance and put everything I could into my 401k, so you guys would have plenty of money, she said proudly. And you thought having enough money would make up for the loss of my wife, and the mother of our children. This time, he heard his bitterness. No, baby, no. You don't understand? I was going to come back for you as soon as things settled down. I was going to contact you. We could go somewhere safe, baby. We could be together, she spoke, her eyes darting around the room. You're only missing one thing, he said in an even voice. What is it, baby? She asked. You forgot about having fun with John Collier, he said. She was scared at first, but then she stood up and held out her arms to him. No, baby, it wasn't like that. John and I just worked together. We were never more than co-workers. Don't lie to me, Meredith, Frank snapped back. Bobby saw you two together in our bedroom. She sighed. God, did Bobby see us? Oh, that's awful, a sob caught in her throat, but then she came to her senses and straightened up again. It was just one time, baby. He said he wouldn't help me unless I gave myself to him. But it was just one time. I swear. Frank stood up, ignoring her. He looked around. Come out, John, he said loudly. I know you're out here somewhere, Meredith continued to wail. No, baby, it's just me. It was just one time. But no sooner had she continued than John Collier appeared from the bedroom. He was wearing a robe and had his hands in his pockets. Lay off, Mary, he muttered, though he guessed they lived together. Hearing Collier use his wife's favorite name made Frank wince. Meredith began to cry. He must have found us through Facebook, Collier grumbled. I warned you, but you just had to check your two offspring. Then his tone changed, to cold and hard. But that doesn't matter now. We need to get out of here. He turned to Frank and pulled an automatic rifle from his robe pocket, which he pointed in Frank's direction. As for you, bright boy, you're the only one who knows we're still alive. No, John, no. Screamed Meredith, but Collier ignored her. Looks like your kids are going to lose not only their daddy but their mommy too, he said with a chuckle, raising his gun at Frank. I wouldn't do that if I were you, came a voice from the hallway. All three turned around in amazement and saw the figure of Celia Murray appear in front of them, holding a Smith & Wesson automatic at Collier's throat. Before Collier could react, a second voice came from behind him. Drop the gun, Collier. It's over. Special Agent Harold Barnes emerged from the kitchen, his gun also pointed at Collier. The former head of the accounting department looked at the two agents hostilely, but then his shoulders slumped. He dropped the gun to the carpet and slowly raised his hands while Barnes held him at gunpoint. Celia quickly went behind the sullen man and twisted one of his arms behind his back, snapping handcuffs around his wrist. She then slid the other arm down and snapped the second handcuff. After securing Collier, she repeated the procedure with Meredith as the two lay on the floor. Barnes made a cell phone call to the Palm Beach Police Department. A second call went to the local FBI office. A short time later, the house was crowded with uniformed and plainclothes police officers. Frank just stood back, looking dumbfounded at what was happening. As the fugitives were led away, Frank scrutinized them both. Collier was muttering to himself, Meredith was crying. Neither looked in Frank's direction when they left. Celia walked over to Barnes, hugged him, and kissed him on the cheek. Thank you for coming with me, partner. I owe you a great debt of gratitude. The senior agent smiled. No, you don't owe me anything. Solving this case will reflect very well in our personal affairs. When Barnes left, Celia finally looked at Frank. To his amazement, she walked over to him, put her arms around his neck, and sobbed. You big idiot, don't you ever do that to me again. You could have killed yourself. He held her tightly until her crying subsided, then he pulled her away from him enough that he could look into her face. What are you doing here? He asked. How did you know where to find me? She smiled through her tears. Laurie called me to chat. When she told me you weren't with them at their grandparents' house, I suspected you were going to do something stupid and started making inquiries. When I saw her Facebook posts, I called the airline and found out that you had booked a flight to Palm Beach. I talked Harold into coming with me, and we've been following you since first thing in the morning. She shook her head. We almost lost you when you took off after that cab, but Harold guessed which way you turned and was right. Frank pulled her even tighter against him. I guess you really are my guardian angel, he said, and kissed her. 2 years later, Frank pulled the collar of his coat tighter around his neck. The familiar high humidity hung in the air, accompanied by the cold, damp breeze blowing in from Puget Sound. Yet, despite the weather, Frank couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment being there. The past 2 years had been fraught with difficulties. Discovering that his wife was alive had been a shock, but the aftermath had been even more devastating for Bobby and Laurie. Meredith's trial and subsequent conviction on multiple criminal charges had inflicted further anguish upon the family. Throughout the media frenzy surrounding her arrest and trial, Frank worried about the impact on his children. While legally the divorce was a mere formality, as Meredith could no longer be declared dead, she was sentenced to spend the next 12 years of her life in Arundel State Prison. The International Marketing Corporation demanded the return of Meredith's life insurance policy and a significant portion of Frank's 401k, which was funded by bonuses she hadn't rightfully earned. Although Frank, as the innocent party, had grounds to retain some of the funds, he wanted no part of his ex-wife's money. Desperate to support his family as their savings dwindled, he diligently sought employment. The offer from a prominent aerospace company was a godsend, not only ensuring financial stability but also offering a fresh start far from the reminders of Meredith in Atlanta, and the unanswerable questions from acquaintances. Relocating to the Pacific Northwest seemed like the optimal solution for them all. Though hesitant to leave their home state, Frank was eager to embrace the opportunity for a new beginning. Fortunately, they were able to sell their Atlanta house and purchase a charming albeit slightly smaller home in Seattle. While Meredith had yearned for luxury, Frank found comfort in the coziness of their new abode. The children seemed to adjust well, already forging friendships at their new school. Returning from the deck, Frank searched for his car keys before popping into the kitchen to find his wife. "Come on, Angel, let's go pick up our kids," he said. Celia smiled warmly. "Thank you for looking after them."